And let's now get in Professor Robert Barrio to discuss this in some detail. Professor Barrio is Professor of Economics at Harvard University, joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Barrio, just wanted to ask you, this entire move towards de-dollarization that's being spoken about so much, is it a trial balloon? Is it something that's feasible? Or at the end of the day, is there really nothing that can replace the US dollar as a reserve currency, at least at this moment?
I think that's the most likely outcome. Certainly, the Chinese currency is almost impossible now to use as an international money. I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said there was some possibility that China could be moving in that direction, but certainly not now with the way they're really disengaging from the Western world. In general, I think international trade and investment is moving away from China. The U.S., for example, is increasing sources from elsewhere, including India. Vietnam is another prominent place. You see that, for example, with Apple, with iPhone production. It's dramatically moving away from China, and many other countries are doing that. So the main international competitor for the U.S. dollar would still be the euro, which will play some role, but then I don't know what a third alternative would be.
Now, there are two other possibilities that I could think of. One would be something backed by gold, perhaps. The other could be a basket of currencies. I know the IMF did try the SDR a long time back, didn't work too well, but would either of those be feasible options right now?
It's the gold standard for a long time, and with some role for silver. It had some virtues. I've written on that topic, but it also has a lot of underlying volatility. It does provide some kind of very long-term anchor, but it's not a very good one. I wrote a paper once on commodity reserve currency, which is the idea that you just expressed of really a basket of things. The idea there was linking to a basket of commodities, of which gold might be one, rather than just gold. And in principle, that could be more effective. Bob Hall wrote a paper some time back figuring out what was the optimal combination of currencies, commodities, in order to achieve something like price stability. But in practice, I think it's impractical. I think it's not going to happen, and I don't think we're going to move back toward gold.
All right, I'm going down the list of other possible options. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which we sometimes hear spoken about. But to many people looking at it from the outside, they do look a bit like a Ponzi scheme. It's a strong word to use, but perhaps not far from the truth either.
I think Ponzi scheme is exactly accurate. I think it's basically a bubble. And I certainly wouldn't want to hold Bitcoin over the long term. I mean, there is some reason why you might have demand for some kind of currency that could preserve value in the long run. And if you had some good device for limiting the quantity of issue, that could work. And Bitcoin was attractive because it had some features of that. I think the biggest problem with Bitcoin is it doesn't really rule out competitors. And there's all this entry of alternative kinds of cryptocurrency. And I think in the end, that's going to drive the value to zero, essentially. That's what I would predict. But the timing, of course, is unknown.
No, that's a really interesting prediction. You think the eventual value of Bitcoin will be zero?
That's what I think. I mean, it's either something that works in the long run or it doesn't. If it works in the long run, it's because there's demand for something without intrinsic value. Now, of course, that's true for paper currency. And underlying that is the idea that there's some limitation on the quantity that's issued. And when that gets threatened, that tends to generate something like extreme inflation, which means that the value is getting lower and lower. With respect to cryptocurrency, I think zero long-run value is the most reasonable prediction. But, bubbles can last a long time, and it's not really known in advance when they're going to end.
Well, that's a really interesting warning that all those who are investing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency will be well advised to heed. Okay, let me paint one other possible alternative to the US dollar as the single reserve currency, which is a system where countries start to have a lot of bilateral trade using their own currencies. Like India, for example, trading with X country and Y country and using the Indian rupee to settle that. Multiple countries trading with their own currency and not necessarily mediating everything through the US dollar. Do you think that is a possible situation which could happen, a viable situation?
Well, you'd certainly see some role for that, and some kinds of transactions would conveniently have that form. Basically, that's not what's done within a single country. You know, you could have bilateral exchange involving goods for goods within countries. And of course, typically that proves to be very inconvenient, and it proves to be not something that works for the broader dimension of economic activity. So I think that's also true with regard to bilateral trade. The typical thing is that you're going to be better off using a common money like the dollar, which is agreed on. And if you don't do that, you know, it becomes much more confusing and limited.
All right, Professor Barrow, thank you so much for joining us with that entire perspective. And as we were discussing, not clear what the alternative to the US dollar actually is.